Welcome to the DINCast. I'm your host, Leckie, the founder and CEO of Big Picture Training. And in this episode, I'm joined by James Peach. James is a multi-award winning global marketing leader whose expertise has shaped iconic brands like Uber, Coca-Cola, Vinted, and Innocent Drinks. He's a sought-after keynote speaker specializing in performance and resilience. On this episode of the DINCast, we'll be exploring the critical gap that can arise when a brand's identity doesn't match its brand image. We'll be envisaging a world where customers of social housing providers have choice and housing providers must compete to attract them. And we'll discuss actionable strategies for building brand that instills trust and creates lasting value for customers. And of course, we'll leverage James' vast marketing knowledge to give you insights on how this can be achieved. So welcome to the DINCast, James.
Thank you so much. What a pleasure to be here, and what a lovely introduction, Jo. Thank you.
Oh, no problem at all. James, you've worked with major brands like Tesco, Innocent, Google, Coca-Cola, and Uber, amongst others. And in your experience, just how crucial is it for a brand's identity to align with its brand image? And what impact does that alignment have on a brand's success?
It's critical. Is the outside the same as the inside? It's the same as we look for. Our brands are ultimately our reputation, our expression of an idea. And so it's the same as people. When you see a person, you want the inside to be the same as the outside. And so in terms of a brand, if the outside looks different to the reality of the experience, then it's false. Then it's you're not the cover of the book is not the same as the content within it. And so it's utterly critical. And in many respects, brands that don't do it get caught out quite quickly. And I've worked a lot in the tech industry, and one of the biggest challenges a lot of tech brands have is winning consumers' trust. You see that with Uber, with Google, with Facebook, and the Cambridge Analytica scandals. I mean, all of these things going wrong. But ultimately, that trust is because the business, the brand that maybe you expected it was or thought it was, is not actually what's going on the inside. So the image on the outside is different to the reality on the inside. And so if you want to win consumers' trust, which means you acquire them, it means you keep them on board the bus for the longest possible time, then you've got to match those two things up.
Absolutely. And that's the fundamental difference, I think, with housing providers and retail environments, for example, such as Innocent Drinks or Uber, very much centered around the customer, where the customer drives the business. In social housing, it's almost the reverse, because customers have very little choice. So they're allocated maybe one or two properties. They either accept it or they're homeless. So they accept the property, and then they have this housing provider that they didn't choose. And ultimately, if the housing provider isn't providing them with some sort of customer satisfaction, there's very little they can do about it. They can't just walk away. So in that relationship, the customer doesn't have the power. The landlord has the power. So it's quite opposite, isn't it? So in industries where customers have real choice, what makes some brands irresistible whilst others sort of struggle to keep them engaged? And what do you think the social housing sector could learn from that?
So that's a really interesting question, because you're right. The consumer has all the power, literally all the power. If you walk into Innocent Drinks, Innocent Smoothies, you might know them, their office in Kensal Rise in Northwest London. If we walked in there right now, we would get to reception, and behind reception would be a wall called the Wall of Love, which has all of the things that consumers have sent in over the years, letters, packaging they've made, tapestries, knitted little woolly hats they've knitted, all of this stuff that they've connected with Innocent so closely. They really love this brand, that they've sent in things that they've made. And the reason that sits behind reception is because it reminds every employee, all 500 odd that work in that office, when they walk in each morning, who's in charge or what their role is. The fact is that those consumers on that wall are in charge. If they stop buying the drinks, it's all over. The lovely fruit juice, the sustainable packaging, the wonderful culture they built, it's all over if the consumers stop buying the drinks. And that's because the consumers are in charge. They completely and utterly hold all the keys. And when the consumer's in charge, it changes your mindset as a business. And what you've been saying about the industry that we're talking to now is it's very different. It's that turned on its head. But it's interesting to think, what changes would that make? And I suppose one of the obvious ones and that comes to life with this wall of love is the understanding of the consumer. The first thing you do as a marketeer at a business is try and understand your audience, your target audience, your consumer. What are their wants? What are their needs? Who are they? What are their touch points? What is their journey that they go on with your business? Like, how
Mm.
do they find your business for the first time? What's their experience in the short term, in the long term? It's an obsession with the consumer. But the three businesses you've called out at the top there, Uber, Vinted, Innocent, all of them have a value of some level of customer obsession. Innocence there is a total focus on the consumer and prioritizing them at every stage. They ask them what drinks they should be making, yet they try and have a conversation at every stage as often as they possibly can to make sure they're serving the consumer as much as possible.
Mm.
Uber, they're trying to build an app that makes it the most effective and efficient way of traveling. And then Vinted, which is a secondhand clothing resale platform, is trying to make it the cheapest and most efficient transaction moment. So for anyone trying to sell their clothes, they're getting the most amount of value from the clothes, whether they're buying them or they're selling them. And so all of those three there are totally obsessed with the consumer. They call it customer obsession in the tech
Yeah.
industry. And that's something that your industry could learn is
Yeah.
really being obsessed with that customer.
I think you're right. I think you're right. And I've been in the sector, working in the sector for 32 years now. 32 years is a very long time. I've seen things come, I've seen things go. What I've seen is that we tend to look back. We look back at what we've done before, what worked, what didn't work. We try reinventing it again. And actually what we're not doing is forward thinking. We are engaging with the customer. There is a lot of work on customer journey at the moment, a lot of work on segmentation, quite a lot of work around, well, a lot of work because we're regulated around tenant perception and customer satisfaction. I think the issue that we have as a sector is that not everyone in the sector is on that journey. So whilst we have pockets in the housing organisations of people who are really on board and customer is first and customer is the most important thing, there are other people in the organisation for whom there is some stigma around customer, and it's bringing them along on the journey. And I really think, there's people like me who've been there for 32 years, but they've not of the same mindset. And I really do think that we have to reinvent ourselves moving forward to make some difference somewhere along the line. So I think there are many industries, and I was talking about this the other day, who've reinvented themselves to stay relevant, haven't they? I was thinking myself about Lucozade, because being the age I am, when you had Lucozade, when I was a child, you had Lucozade when you were ill. So you would drink Lucozade, it would make you better, and it was a treat because we weren't allowed fizzy drink. Now Lucozade have reinvented themselves. Now Lucozade is a sport drink. You have Lucozade when you're aiming to get fit, when you're very fit, when you're in the gym, whatever. It's a sport drink, isn't it? So they've really reinvented themselves. And Lego did the same thing, didn't they? Back in about 10 years ago, I suppose. I think they sort of had a bit of a change, maybe 20 even. But they had a bit of a change and they started really engaging with the customer, as you say, didn't they? So what do you think housing providers could do? How could housing providers transform their customer experience? What can we learn from these people?
Yeah, I mean, there's tons, and it's a challenging area. What can we learn from those that have reinvented themselves?
Yeah.
I'm going to give you a couple of examples here. The first one is going to be Vinted, because and the lesson here is it's easy to blame the customer. So
Yes.
Vinted operates in Germany as one of the 20 markets that it's currently in. And in Germany, what they found was that people would make their transaction outside of the Vinted app, because they could do it on PayPal, they could do it in different ways, which means they could search for the clothes and communicate with the potential buyer on the app, but then they would go somewhere else to make the transaction. That means that Vinted doesn't make any money from that transaction.
No.
So
Yeah.
that's a really bad thing. So a really bad thing for Vinted, because it needs to make money in order to live, in order to survive and operate.
It's also harder for the customer, isn't it, to do that? It's harder for the customer to do that.
It
You want to
is,
make
but
it easy.
it's harder from a point of view of it takes more work, but ultimately they're saving because they don't have to pay Vinted a fee.
Yeah.
So Vinted then, one mindset could have been, and was in truth, oh, how can we punish the customer? They're going this way. What can we take away from them? We need to
Yeah.
stop them doing this thing. We need to
Yeah.
stop them subverting our model. Like, so how, let's take away, if someone does that, let's take away these benefits, or let's only show them this, or let's punish the customer. However, when the CEO looked at this problem, he quickly realized, because he's a fantastic and wonderful leader, that the problem is not the customer, the problem is our business model. If we had the right business model, the customer would want to stay on the platform, want to use it, because we offer the best possible type of service. And so that was the mindset shift they took, and that completely changed how they approach the problem and how they solve the problem. And they have ultimately solved that problem by having that mindset shift. Just because the customer is not doing exactly what you want, that means that you need to work out how you can provide a service that does exactly what the customer wants. How can you adapt your business model?
How do you do that then, James? How do you do that?
So you have to have a optimistic entrepreneurial mindset and really look at the problem. But ultimately, you need to talk to the customers, work out what it is that has built this instinct to go and behave in the way that they have. Whether that's focus groups, whether that's surveying, whether that's whatever, but it's really understanding the customer and the decision process they're making in the deepest possible way. But also, as an approach, as a team, you want to make sure you're inspiring that culture within your organization, a culture that is thinking not how do we control this this customer, this user, how do we punish them? It's how can we serve them better? Another example is Uber, which very famously, when I joined Uber, it was kicked out of London. It lost its license to operate TfL 2 years in a row. We had black cabs on the Mall protesting and stopping traffic around London. We had all sorts of problems. And Uber was very much disliked. Even if you didn't know or had never taken a trip on Uber, you knew it was not to be trusted. You saw the allegations in the newspapers. You saw this negativity around it. Whilst only very recently, Uber have now they now report that they put black cabs on the app itself. They like the relationship with TfL and black cabs and the taxi industry has completely changed. And they now work in tandem with a lot of the trade unions and the black cab industry. So that huge change that's happened between sort of 6, 7, 8 years is ultimately through listening. It's through listening to the feedback they were getting, hearing what the government was saying, hearing what the policymakers were saying, and not fighting, but accepting that is the status quo. That is what people are saying, and thinking, right, how can we react to this in a positive, open, collaborative way?
And I think that's the mindset shift that actually needs to happen in the housing sector at the moment, because we have a bit of a dichotomy in the sector in that we are an enforcement agency in some respects, because you've got tenants living in your properties and you do need to enforce the terms and conditions of the tenancy on them from time to time when they really don't comply and they're causing everybody's lives a misery. So there's that enforcement, but traditionally it was an enforcement approach that we took. And you'll have people who work in the sector who think that's their job, to enforce the tenancy agreement, when in actual fact their job is to serve the customer. And if the customer's satisfied, less likely to behave in those ways. What I really loved was when you said about innocent drinks, and you walk in and there's all the nice things and the good things that customers have said and done about innocent drinks. And I think one of the big issues in housing at the moment is the housing ombudsman's raised their profile. It means that a lot of people are now complaining because they now know where to go. So if they're not satisfied with their landlord, they're going to the ombudsman. The ombudsman's seen 100%, 150% more than that increase in terms of complaints coming in. Housing providers the same. And they're struggling with this complaint culture now, which is it's a bit negative. Rather than welcoming complaints as positive feedback, they're seeing them as something negative. And often on training, I will say, so what is your organization? How do you celebrate success? What do you do? What do you do when you have a compliment? And I love, that, you're making it visible when you get compliments. This is what your customers are saying about you, the good things they're saying about you, turning the complaints on their head almost. What's the learning from your complaints? Talk about that. share how you're making a difference. So can you think of an organization that's completely transformed its customer experience? And what do you think we can learn from it? So you've talked about Uber. Can you think of any others?
So, I mean, Uber, there's a good example. Vinted is a pretty good example of turning around its customer experience.
Yeah,
It used to have a terrible score on Trustpilot, and it's completely turned that around now. And it used to have a very computer says no. It didn't really overinvest, I suppose, in customer services, but now
yeah,
it's turned that completely on its head. And you generally find, I mean, Amazon's another good example. Amazon have got some of the most state-of-the-art customer services
they
where
have.
they put a hell of a lot of investment in pre-customer services, so making sure that information is there so people don't need to use customer services.
Yeah,
But when they do, you can do things now such as you request a callback. The callback occurs within 30 seconds. The person behind the phone already knows who you are, the order you've made, why you're calling, and all this information. Where they've completely turned that around, and the consumer experience then is you come away from that not thinking, oh, good, my call has been resolved. You come away thinking, wow, that was so impressive. I wish
yeah.
other businesses operated like that. That when there was a problem, it was such a positive. It actually adds to the brand image. It
It
doesn't
does.
detract from it.
It does. It
And
also
that's
raises the bar for everybody else.
absolutely raises the
Yeah.
bar. And I mean, Innocent is an extraordinary example of customer service in that they have something called the banana phone. And the banana phone was written on the bottom of every bottle. Do give the banana phone a call. And there it is, the phone number on the bottom of every bottle. It's still there today. If you call the banana phone, it rings every single phone in the office. So
Oh, does
it starts with reception, and then it rings the office in pods, so in different areas until someone picks up. So that means the insight there, what they're trying to achieve is they're putting the consumer and the business as close to each other as possible. So even if you
Yeah.
worked in fruit technology, or you're a fruit buyer or in HR, at any point you could pick up the phone to a consumer and have to deal with their complaint. It's interesting, their approach, which is a very human, sort of engaged approach, and people come away. So another good example where Innocent is often, if you put a complaint in that you had a bad experience, they'll respond via a handwritten letter with some vouchers for a free Innocent drink. And so the message here is that they've focused on the experience of complaints and thought, this is a negative world. How can we actually turn it into a brand attribute that people come away thinking, wow, I like Innocent better than I did before I was
Yeah.
complaining, which is a real turnaround in your thinking about
Yeah.
the customer services aspect of a business.
Absolutely. There's research out there that proves, isn't there? If you handle a complaint well, it actually has a higher emotional impact on someone than just making small improvements to an already good service. So handling a
Absolutely.
complaint really well can really change brand loyalty, can't it?
It absolutely can. And also remember, you have three levels of consumers. You have advocates, neutrals, and detractors. And
Mm.
often someone coming into a customer services is in a detractor world. If you can bring them
Yes.
to an advocate world, because you have quite a big moment there of a one-to-one
Yeah.
moment where you can deliver a lot of communication and a lot of ultimately sort of brand advocacy. It's a really powerful moment. Detractors are really, really hard to move, so that's a wonderful moment in order to move them up the scale through to neutral, and
Yeah.
ultimately
And I,
being
I think that's one of
ambassadors for
the
you.
issues that we have in housing is how do we move those detractors? Have you got any thoughts on that? How can housing providers go beyond sort of this transactional service to create those real emotional connections with their tenants, and particularly those detractors? There are a lot of them out there at the moment. A lot of them. If you've watched any news programs, how do we change those mindsets?
It's
What can we
it's
do?
it's it's almost always, and this is a boring answer, but it's almost always communication and collaboration. Like,
Mm.
the more context people have, the closer they are, the more they can develop an emotive feeling for it and become an advocate. The less information people have, the further away they go, then the more they can make up stuff. and they can
Yeah.
become keyboard warriors and just
Yes, and they
complain,
do.
complain, complain. But again, the more you can communicate, a lot of brands just simply are doing great stuff. A lot of businesses are doing great stuff and they're trying their hardest, but because they fail on the communication, they fail to
Yep.
cross that chasm between their business and the consumer. Then the consumer, they just presume that the consumer must know what this business is doing and all of the hard work they're putting in, but they often don't. Over
Yep.
communicating time and time and time again, bringing the consumer in. Another innocent example: they have an AGM, the annual general meeting, and the AGM was where they would bring in 200 consumers into the office on a Saturday and test out new products with them, ask them about what they feel about this, that, and the other
Yep.
about innocent, ask them questions, do focus groups. They're always trying to cross that chasm and
Yep.
communicate, over communicate with consumers. It's difficult. It's to some extent quite boring for a business because you're so business focused on
Yep.
operations and all of that stuff. But it's so critically important to take that time to over communicate. It solves so many
Absolutely.
problems.
Couldn't agree with you more. We say this all the time on training: communicate, communicate, communicate. You cannot communicate enough. You
Yeah.
must communicate. It's one of the biggest issues that customers of housing providers have, is this under communication. There is a lot of involvement from customers. Housing providers do engage with their customers, but I wonder how much listening they're actually doing. So they're doing the engagement because they're supposed to do that. Um, uh, and they're getting all of this information, but it's how they use it to change the services. I think that's where the gap is. So there's all this data coming in from complaints, but what I don't see is the connection between the complaints and the learning and then the service improvement. I don't see that happening. And so we keep getting the same old complaints over and over again, which leads to detractors at the end of the day, doesn't it? People who just give up.
It does.
Have you seen any examples of where, or can you tell us how organizations you've worked with have really used that information from a poor situation like a complaint to learn? How do they do it?
Absolutely. And ultimately, you need to, depending on how much data, these are all data points, and how many data points there are, how many bits of feedback you've got depends on
Mm,
how you respond and how well you can respond. But let's say I work in the fast moving consumer goods industry, FMCG, which is selling things in supermarkets and whatnot.
yeah.
And when you put things out to research and you try and understand the barriers and the drivers to your product. So what are the barriers? The reason people aren't buying it. And what are the drivers? The reasons people are buying your product.
Mm,
And when you find out those core drivers, the big things that mean people are purchasing your product off the shelf, you're going to exploit them. You're going to work really hard and just try and drive them further. And
yeah.
similarly with the barriers, which is what you're discussing here, these
Mm,
detractors, what they're saying is what they don't like about you. You really have to work on those.
you
And
do.
you find that they're always the same thing. For example, if you're in consumer goods and you're selling a product, the biggest barrier will pretty much always be price. It will always be people want stuff cheaper and better. Of course they do. We are human beings and we're in a capitalist society.
Yeah.
But so you take that, and so let's say innocent Coke, they find that a large proportion of the consumers feel that their products are too expensive. Now you can't always drop a price because you need to make margin in order to run your business, but you can work on value. You can
Yes.
show your consumers how valuable the product is, like how much. This just comes back to communication, but over communicate how the product's made,
Yeah.
why it costs what it does, what the what the balance sheet or whatever the best way of displaying it is behind it. Show how much value goes into creating that
Mm,
product, which means it
mm,
comes at a certain cost. So
mm,
that's and Innocent, which is a premium product, an expensive product, but wanted to be mass market. So generally, it was a Waitrose and Ocado shopper, generally affluent
mm,
people often in the southeast. It needed to be a mass market product. So what it did, it built a strategy to communicate to people the value behind the investment they were making around natural fruit, reusable packaging, recyclable packaging, whatever those messages were. And now it's the biggest fruit juice company in Europe. So
yeah.
you can you look at the detractors, you look at the problems that are coming in, and you work out creative ways to solve them. But again, it's a lot of this starts from your culture, a culture of
Yeah.
open feedback. feedback comes in, it's a gift, it's fuel for your business. It's not negative, it's fuel
Yeah.
in order to, and that's the culture you've got to work from.
I think so. And I think the issue we have in housing at the moment, there's so many pressures coming in at us. There's been some incidents in the past that mean that now there is heavy investment in stock condition. And I think the resources aren't being pushed in the right direction. So for organizations such as Vinted, such as Uber, such as Innocent Drinks, what percentage of their resources would be focused on learning from the customer, learning from customer perception, learning from complaints, and really driving change? How heavily would they invest in that?
In a fast moving tech company like Uber or Vinted, you're looking at a massive proportion of the business. All of the sort of active roles, which are those marketing a product, which are those building a product, less sort of the HR and the more supportive roles, all of them are ultimately focused on feedback from the consumer, or working on the response from the consumer. If you're not doing that, if you're blinkered to that information, then you're just singing your own song, and you are completely cutting yourself out to the outside world. You're closing the door, closing the windows, and just doing your own thing. Ultimately, business are in service of any consumer, in that, like I said at the start of this, innocent, if the consumer stopped buying the drink, innocent doesn't exist. So you need to use the information you have from those individuals in order to fuel the business, and point it in the best way possible. So, for example, at Vinted, they are constantly and obsessively updating the product and making it the best it can possibly be. Where do they get the information to do that from? They get it from consumers or users of the product, and they also get it from the tech behind it, where they can see how users are behaving on the platform. All of that is human data. So the majority of the business is looking at how consumers, customers, users, whatever you want to call them, behave, and using that for fuel to improve the business ongoing.
And I think we've hit the nail on the head, because I think that's not where the focus is in housing at the moment. I don't think the majority of the business is focusing on what the customer is saying and how to improve that. I don't think that's where the main focus is. And certainly you wouldn't feel that when you went into an organization across the whole organization. They would get pockets of it, but there's people there who will block that. There's people there who are still saying the wrong things and doing the wrong things. So it's really interesting. It's a really interesting journey that housing is on at the moment. I think we need to pivot. We need to move really quickly. And I think we aren't moving quickly enough. And as a business owner myself, I know that if we get poor feedback, it will keep me awake at night. It will keep me awake at night until I have figured out how to change that. Because reputation is everything, isn't it? Reputation is everything. And so I often think, I don't understand why housing providers aren't of the same mindset. Why doesn't it bother them that their customers feel this way? And as you said, I think right at the beginning, there's a bit of a defensiveness and a bit of a blame the customer. And you said that's what Vinted were doing right at the beginning. You said that, didn't you? And I think we've hit the nail on the head. I think that's where we're at in the housing sector, and I think that's what we need to change. So it's been wonderful talking to you today, James. I think just as a final thing before we go, how do you think then, just to wrap it up, how can housing providers go beyond transactional service to create those emotional connections with their tenants, do you think? How do you think we can move towards that?
I think it starts from a place of culture. It starts from agreeing internally who you are and how you behave in the sector.
Yeah.
Whether that's every organization on planet Earth has a problem they're trying to solve, and and really establishing that. And if your problem is, there is not enough consumer focus in the housing sector, whatever it is, and then working out how you're going to address that problem, sitting down with your team, whatever that is, and agreeing, right, we're going to build a culture to address this problem. These are the ways we're going to do that. Yeah. As in putting this problem, if we believe that this is a problem for the housing sector, putting it front and front and center,
Center.
and then working out how we're going to address it, what we're going to do culturally, what it means for how we act, how we communicate, our tone of voice, like every touch point we have with the consumer, what does that mean? And then building your business behind that. The ultimate, it sounds like the challenge is that it hasn't been put front and center. Other things are, and so you have to point the boat at what's most important.
Exactly. I think housing providers will tell you they've done that. They've got mission statements, they've got visions, they've got values. If you go into an organisation, as we do though, and ask everyone in that organisation what are your organisation's values, maybe 80% won't be able to tell you, because it's just not embedded. It's just not embedded. And I think that's the core. I think that's the key. We've done all the work. Now we need to really point the ship at it. Point the ship at it and point the resources at it and really embed that culture. And that starts at the top, doesn't it? Ultimately, that starts at the top.
It does start at the top. It absolutely does start at the top. And the moment you start to see value from a new direction like that, suddenly everyone will come in the same direction. So it's about taking those big first steps.
It is, isn't it? And bringing those people on board, because ultimately, if they've not got a good experience internally, they're not going to give a good experience externally. So
exactly.
Thank you for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure, James. Thank you for giving us your time. If the listeners would like to find out more about you and connect with you, where can they find you?
Yeah, you can definitely reach out to me on LinkedIn, James Peach. And I'm also on Instagram at Mr. James Peach. So do get in touch if there's anything interesting if you'd like to learn more.
Will do. Thank you so much.